Formula One through history has seen many exciting and entertaining eras, but perhaps none were more electrifying than the turbo era. From Renault's groundbreaking RS01 in 1977 to the turbo ban that closed the book a decade later, let's explore the revolutionary technology, the jaw-dropping horsepower wars, the rivalries that were seared into our memories, and find out why nothing since has matched the raw excitement of those fire-breathing monsters. Right from the get-go, Formula One and the World Championship had regulations which offered two engine formulas, normally aspirated or forced induction. Whilst the size limits and difference in those two engine regulations varied over the years, in general, normally aspirated engines were allowed to have a capacity 2 or more times that of forced induction engines, the exception being the first 2 years of the championship, when pre-war regulations were used, heavily favouring supercharged engines. At this point, a quick explainer of the difference between forced induction and normal aspiration is probably warranted. Feel free to skip over the next couple of minutes if this isn't of interest. Engines work on the Otto cycle, or more simply put, suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Each cylinder in an engine performs each of these operations in order. The piston moves down, creating a vacuum. A valve opens, allowing fuel and air to rush into the space. The piston then rises again, compressing the fuel-air mixture, at which point a spark ignites the compressed mixture, causing an explosion which forces the piston down. This is where an engine's power is created. Finally, the piston rises again and another valve is opened to allow the burnt gases to exit the engine. This is what comes out of your exhaust pipe. On the suck stroke, a normally aspirated engine relies on atmospheric pressure to fill the cylinder. A forced induction engine uses a fan or compressor to push much more fuel and air into the cylinder, which makes the explosion bigger, thus releasing more power. There are two types of forced induction: supercharging, where the engine drives the compressor using belts, which costs some power and also limits the amount of extra fuel and air which can be pushed into the cylinder. Turbochargers, on the other hand, use the exhaust gases to drive one side of a turbofan, whilst the other side forces the fuel-air mixture into the cylinder. There is no theoretical limit to the amount of pressure which can be generated by a turbocharger in this way, although practically, a pressure relief valve, also called a wastegate, is used to limit the pressure below that which would destroy the engine completely. One disadvantage a turbo engine has, when compared to a supercharger or normally aspirated engine, is that the exhaust gases take some time to spin the compressor up to high enough speeds to make a material difference to the amount of fuel-air mixture entering the cylinder. Thus, when a driver stands on the accelerator, power delivery does not happen instantly, a delay which is known as the dreaded turbo lag, of which we will hear more later in our story. From 1954 onwards, supercharged cars disappeared from Formula One. In 1966, when the FIA increased normally aspirated engine sizes to 3 litres, it set the limit for forced induction to 1.5 litres. Supercharged engines would be outclassed at this equivalence factor, and turbocharging was thought too complex, too expensive, and rife with reliability issues. So, for a decade, 3-litre normally aspirated engines were the norm. Then, in 1977, the nationalised French car maker Renault entered Formula One, building its own cars and engines. And the engineers at Renault believed that they could do what no one else dared, and build a small turbo engine which was powerful enough to compete with the normally aspirated engines, and could be reliable enough to base a championship challenge around. This is the Renault RS01, the first true turbocharged Formula One car, designed by Bernard Dudot. Its 1.5-litre V6 turbo engine debuted at the 1977 British Grand Prix, much to the amusement of the established Formula One teams. It was ridiculed for its unreliability, as the Renault team battled with repeated turbocharger failures. And between the whistle of its wastegate valve and the plumes of white smoke it sent up every time another turbo failed, it quickly gained the nickname the Yellow Teapot. But whilst other teams were laughing at them, Renault's engineers were quietly getting on with the job of learning about the practical impacts of turbocharging and developing the engine's ability to generate power and be reliable. It's worth noting that even in 1977, the Renault engine was generating a competitive amount of horsepower in comparison to the near ubiquitous Cosworth DFV. The team entered 5 races that year, failing to finish in 4 and failing even to qualify for the 5th. It seemed the general derision of the paddock was warranted, but Renault persisted nonetheless. And Renault's persistence paid off. In 1978 at Monaco, a circuit ill-suited to the turbo engine because of its short straights and many corners, driver Jean-Pierre Jabouille scored a 10th place finish, marking the first time a turbocharged car had finished a Formula 1 Grand Prix. Later in the season at Watkins Glen, Jabouille drove the car to a 4th place finish, scoring the first championship points for a turbocharged car. It was still hugely unreliable, but the RS01 made it to the finish line 5 times that season, marking a significant improvement to the previous year. For 1979, Renault expanded their effort by adding a second car for René Arnoux, and there were immediate signs that the team had made a step forward in performance, if not reliability, when Jabouille scored the first ever pole position for a turbocharged car in South Africa. The Kyalami circuit is nearly 1,500 metres above sea level, and as a result the air is very thin. For the turbocharged engine, this wasn't the handicap it was for normally aspirated cars, and for this reason the Kyalami success was somewhat written off by Renault's competitors. Reliability-wise, the first half of the season was a disappointment, with the 2 drivers registering only 1 finish each. But then came the team's home race in France. The 2 Renaults blitzed qualifying, with Jabouille and Arnoux securing the front row of the grid, and without the benefit of high altitude this time. In the race, Jabouille simply romped away to claim the first ever victory for a turbocharged car, and the first forced induction victory since Fangio won for Alfa Romeo in 1951. Jabouille was the first French driver to win the French Grand Prix as a Formula 1 World Championship race, and he did so in a French car on French tyres. It was a glorious day for France, and especially so for Renault, whose decision to go with a turbo engine had been vindicated. Arnoux fought a legendary battle with Gilles Villeneuve for second place, which was resolved in the Ferrari's favour, but even so, a 1-3 finish, with 2 French cars on the French Grand Prix podium, was cause for much celebration. Arnoux scored 2 more podiums before the end of the season and finished the year in a creditable 8th place in the Drivers' Championship, whilst for Renault, 6th place in the Constructors' Championship, ahead of both McLaren and Brabham, was an excellent showing. In 1980, Renault reached a new level of performance, and this time it was much harder for competitors to ignore. In the second race of the season, in Brazil, Jabouille claimed pole position, but suffered a turbo failure just after half distance. Arnoux took over in front and reeled off the last 15 laps to win his first Grand Prix. In South Africa, they dominated qualifying again, taking out the front row. The gap between the Renaults and the rest of the field was notable. Third placeman Piquet was nearly 2 seconds adrift of the 2 turbocharged cars. Once again, Jabouille led for much of the race, until a puncture ended his day. Arnoux was there to pick up the pieces and claim his second victory. Renault now led the Constructors' Championship for the first time ever. Later in the season in Austria, the 2 Renaults captured the front row again, with Arnoux claiming his first pole position, then leading until tyre troubles forced him to pit. This time, it was Jabouille who stepped up to claim Renault's 3rd victory of the season. Meanwhile, things were happening at Ferrari. The team had clinched the Drivers' and Constructors' World Championships in 1979, but in 1980 its title defence had been shambolic. Early in the season, after seeing Renault's success, Ferrari had started work on its own turbocharged car, using a V6 engine and mounting it in the back of a chassis which looked like it had been cobbled together from components found in the skip at the back of the Maranello factory. Gilles Villeneuve gave the car a run in practice at the Italian Grand Prix at Imola, although it didn't race and wouldn't be seen again in 1980. At the start of the 1981 season then, there was competition amongst turbocharged cars, as well as with the wider field. Renault's years of experience with the turbo engine made them favourite in the turbo battle with Ferrari and Toleman. Yes, the tiny British Formula 2 team had entered Formula 1 and had done so with an all-new turbo engine built by its Formula 2 engine builder Brian Hart. To say it was a shoestring operation would be unfair to shoestrings, and drivers Derek Warwick and Brian Henson only qualified for a race each. Ferrari had a good start to the year, with a car which looked even worse than the test mule which ran at Imola the year before. Nevertheless, the team went well at the San Marino Grand Prix, with both drivers leading the race at different times. Ferrari clinched pole position, fastest lap, and led for 46 of the 60 laps of the race. The little red tractor may have been ugly, but here was further confirmation that turbos were the future. 2 races later, Ferrari took the first victory for a turbo car at Monaco. The tight and twisty circuit was unsuitable for a car suffering from massive turbo lag, which the Ferrari certainly had in spades. It was a somewhat fortuitous victory, with Piquet crashing out from the lead, and then Alan Jones having fuel problems. But Villeneuve won, and Pironi took 4th place, a great result for Ferrari at a circuit so ill-suited to a turbo car. If the win in Monaco was largely thanks to the problems of others, Villeneuve's win in the next race at Hurrah in Spain was very different. Villeneuve had only qualified 7th, but made a lightning start off the line to be 3rd at the first corner. Then, at the end of the first lap, in a race-defining move, he passed Reutemann down the straight on the way to turn 1. When Alan Jones had a momentary lapse of concentration and drove his car off the road on lap 14, Villeneuve assumed the lead with Reutemann behind. The combination of turbo power and Villeneuve brilliance was enough to overcome poor handling and huge turbo lag and allow the French-Canadian to go on to claim victory. Over a full lap, Reutemann's Williams was much faster than the Ferrari, but Villeneuve drove as slowly as possible through the twisty part of the course and was able to make use of the turbo power to pull out enough of a gap to prevent being overtaken under braking on the circuit's 2 main straights. Lapping a full 6 seconds slower than qualifying pace, Villeneuve held up Reutemann enough that a queue developed behind the battling pair, with Jacques Laffite and John Watson both passing the Williams. Neither could do anything about the Ferrari though, and Villeneuve ran out the winner with Laffite, Watson, Reutemann and De Angelis all finishing within a second and a quarter of the winning car. For Renault, this was a chastening experience. Ferrari had looked sharp in the first half of the season, whilst Renault had managed just a 3rd and a 5th place for Prost and Arnoux respectively. Renault needed to turn their season around, and once more its home race was to prove to be pivotal. Arnoux clinched pole position, but was caught out when there were problems with the start lights. Piquet jumped into the lead and Prost climbed into 2nd place. Then, a sudden thunderstorm struck the circuit on the 58th lap, bringing so much rain that the race had to be stopped. It would restart, and the result would be aggregated using the times from the 2 parts. This was to benefit Prost, who was able to switch to soft Michelin tyres for what will be a 22-lap sprint to the flag. But Piquet's Brabham was on Goodyear tyres, and as this was the American company's first race back in the sport, they only had hard tyres designed to last a full 80-lap race. Piquet was going to be at a disadvantage. Straight from the restart, Prost was passed and gone for the rest of the afternoon, whilst Arnoux and Pironi jumped the Brabham shortly after. Prost had an untroubled run to the checkered flag, taking the first of his 51 Grand Prix victories. His second wasn't long in coming. At the Dutch Grand Prix he claimed pole position from Arnoux, and then saw off a challenge from the reigning world champion Alan Jones. At Monza a fortnight later, he took his and Renault's 3rd win of the season, despite rain dampening the track and catching several drivers out mid-race. By the end of the season, turbo cars had won 5 of the 15 races, with Renault placing 3rd and Ferrari placing 5th in the Constructors' World Championship. Brabham and BMW had announced a new partnership for 1982, with the German company creating a 4-cylinder turbo engine based on a production cylinder block first introduced in 1961. Paul Rocher had initially turbocharged the unit for sports car racing, but its prodigious power output persuaded the company to enter Formula One. The 4-cylinder design offered some benefits over the V6 engines of Renault and Ferrari. Only 1 turbo was required, rather than 1 per bank of the V6 engines, and the 4 cylinders meant each was closer to the theoretically desirable 500cc per cylinder target. The better efficiency meant less cooling was required, meaning smaller radiators. As a whole, this made it possible for the Brabham to be lighter than the other turbo cars in 1982. At the first race in South Africa, turbocharged cars filled the first 6 places on the grid, and the 2 Renaults finished 1st and 3rd, with Prost winning after suffering a puncture, then racing back through the field on new tyres. In Brazil, Brabham switched from its BMW-powered turbo car back to its Cosworth-powered one after problems at the first race. Brabham and Williams fitted their cars with large water tanks for cooling their brakes. The tanks were empty, but could be refilled at the end of the race as the rules allowed essential fluids to be topped up before weighing. The cars were able to race underweight, giving them a huge performance advantage. Renault protested, and Piquet and Rosberg, who had finished first and second, were disqualified, handing a second win of the season to Prost. Brabham stuck with the Ford-powered car at Long Beach, and neither version of the Brabham was at the next race at Imola, as the FOCA teams boycotted the San Marino Grand Prix in protest at the Brazilian disqualifications. This meant the race was a straight battle between Renault and Ferrari, and when both Renaults retired, between the two Ferrari drivers. Pironi beat Villeneuve in what the French-Canadian believed to be a betrayal, and the feud between the two was to cost him his life at the next race in Belgium. In Monaco, both Renault drivers threw away race victory whilst leading, and in the crazy finish which ensued, Pironi ran out of fuel in the tunnel on the last lap while also heading for victory. Of the turbo cars, only Piquet's Brabham BMW wasn't in contention for the win, and things were to get worse for the reigning world champion in Detroit, where he would fail to even qualify. Prost would lead once more, until engine problems slowed and eventually stopped him. From not qualifying in Detroit, Piquet went to the next race in Canada and claimed BMW's first win as an engine supplier. Pironi had qualified on pole position by a mile, but after stalling on the start line, he was involved in the accident which killed Italian rookie Riccardo Paletti. Piquet led Patrese home in a unique Brabham 1-2, the race leader with a BMW turbo engine and the second place car with a Ford Cosworth. Pironi claimed his second victory of the season in Holland, whilst Arnoux had an enormous accident at the Tarzan corner when the left front wheel fell off his car. There was some success for Tollman too, who had had precious little of it since entering Formula One. Derek Warwick claimed fastest lap in the Hart-powered car. There was more to come from Tollman at the next race at Brands Hatch too. The team came up with a plan to gain some exposure at its home race. Warwick would start on half a tank of fuel, turn the turbo up as far as possible, and run on the softest Pirellis. In theory, with such a performance advantage, the Tollman would carve through the field, hopefully gaining some exposure before the tank ran dry. In practice it worked brilliantly, with Warwick climbing up as high as second place before running out of fuel and gaining enormous media coverage as a result. Gathering even more coverage was another team planning to start on half tanks. Brabham was going to refuel both cars and give them new tyres halfway through the race, believing the performance advantage would allow them to claim victory. We never found out, as neither car made it to half distance. In France, it was Renault's turn to have an issue between its two drivers. Arnoux led a 1-2 finish, but Prost was incensed because he believed Arnoux was going to let him win to aid his championship challenge. Once more, Brabham failed to reach half distance, so we still didn't get to see the team's pit stop strategy in action. By the time of the German race, Pironi was championship leader and favourite. However, an enormous qualifying accident ended his career. New Ferrari teammate Patrick Tambay claimed victory, but the team's hopes of the driver's title were well and truly blown. Piquet almost made it as far as his pit stop before crashing with Eliseo Salazar, briefly scuffling with the Chilean driver after they had exited their cars. Brabham did finally get to do their pit stop in Austria, and as the season wound to a close, it was clear that reliability had done for Renault and BMW's challenge. Whilst Ferrari appeared to have conquered reliability, but had lost its drivers to bad luck, there was some consolation for the Italian team in claiming the Constructors' title, the first to do so running a turbocharged engine. Of the 16 races, 8 had been won by turbo cars. Turbos claimed pole position in 14 of those races and fastest laps in 10. The writing really was on the wall for teams using normally aspirated engines. 1983 brought new regulations and more turbo engines. Alfa Romeo entered with a turbocharged V8 from the start of the season, whilst Honda returned to Formula One with the successful Formula 2 team, Spirit. The engine would also be seen in the back of the Williams by the end of the season. Meanwhile, Porsche were working on a new engine which was paid for and branded by the Saudi company TAG. It would appear in the back of the McLaren for the last 4 races of the season. Both of these engines were to see success before the end of the turbo era. Existing turbo engines also made their way to other teams. Renault would be supplying theirs to Lotus, whilst BMW would power the German ATS team. It was clear that Formula One was a sport for turbos now, and whilst the 2 American races and Monaco were won by normally aspirated cars, every other race would fall to a turbocharged car. Each of the big three teams picked up a victory in the first 4 races, and the championship battle ebbed and flowed between Renault's Prost, Piquet's Brabham, and the 2 Ferraris of Tambay and Arnoux. None could put together a decisive run of results, because the different cars seemed to suit different tracks. Arnoux won in Canada and Germany, but in between had a nightmare of a race at Silverstone, where the Goodyear cross-ply tyres were no match for the Michelin radials. Prost, meanwhile, dominated in Britain and Austria, but in between was blown away by the Ferraris in Germany. When the season reached its finale in South Africa, Prost, Piquet and Arnoux were still in with a shot at the title. Prost led Piquet by 2 points and Arnoux by 8. Having won the previous 2 races, the momentum was with Piquet, and Brabham all but assured his victory by flying in specially mixed high-octane fuel for the race. Tambay qualified on pole, but was immediately passed by Piquet, who was running a low fuel load and planning an early pit stop. Patrese jumped into second place and held the field up whilst his teammate built up a lead. Arnoux retired after 9 laps, ending his chances. Prost after 35 laps, now needing Piquet to drop to 5th or lower to clinch the title. That never looked likely, and Piquet eased off considerably to ensure he made it to the finish line, allowing Patrese to pass him for the win and Andrea de Cesaris to claim second place for Alfa Romeo. BMW was the first company to power a driver to the World Championship with a turbocharged engine. The 4-cylinder unit had surpassed Ferraris and was now believed to be the most powerful on the grid. In 1984, another rule change was to turn the sport on its head again. Refuelling was banned, and cars were limited to 220 litres of fuel for the whole race. For the teams running turbo engines, that was going to introduce a significant performance constraint. The number of cars with turbo engines had grown from the previous year. McLaren and Williams would run the Tag and Honda engines respectively. Ligier became the 3rd team using the Renault turbo, whilst BMW would extend its supply to Arrows. Even minnows at the back of the grid were getting in on the turbo game. Osella would use the Alfa Romeo engine, whilst Ram and Spirit would also receive the Hart engines previously exclusive to Toleman. The only team to stick with the normally aspirated engine for the whole season would be Tyrrell. That move was to produce some interesting results and also to lead to a scandal later in the season. From the start, it was clear that McLaren had the car to beat. At the season opener in Brazil, Lauda had been well on his way to an easy victory when battery problems ended his race. New teammate Alain Prost, who had been sacked by Renault for failing to win the championship the previous season, took over the lead from his replacement at Renault, Derek Warwick, and went on to claim victory. Lauda then won in South Africa, and from there the title race would only include the 2 McLaren drivers. Prost won 7 times, Lauda 5, but Lauda's better reliability would be enough to clinch the championship. Even with McLaren's domination, the championship was far from boring. By dint of fantastic consistency and excellent reliability, Elio De Angelis was an outsider in the title race. When the season reached Germany, the 11th of the 16 races, De Angelis was just 6.5 points behind Prost and 4 behind Lauda. The Lotus team had a decision to make: play safe and maintain its 100% reliability record, or turn up the turbo and go for broke. It chose the latter, which resulted in 4 retirements in the last 6 races, ending their title challenge. Nelson Piquet had staged a mid-season revival after scoring no points in the opening 6 rounds. In Canada, he won by dominating the race from pole position, then a week later went to Detroit, where he had suffered the embarrassment of failing to qualify 2 years previously, and claimed pole position. He then won the race, despite having his race car wrecked as a result of a start line accident triggered by Nigel Mansell. In his spare car, he just drove away from the opposition, whilst others destroyed their tyres, hit walls or suffered mechanical problems. Martin Brundle's Tyrrell claimed 2nd place, just a second behind Piquet at the line, but this result was to be Tyrrell's downfall. Tyrrell was the only team planning pit stops in 1984, using them to top up their cars' water tanks. This was a development of the strategy which had backfired for Williams and Brabham in 1982, with the in-race top-up making the new solution legal. In theory, the car started at a legal weight, and as the race went on, water from the tanks was released by the water injection system to cool the incoming fuel-air mixture. In practice, the tanks were effectively empty, and what water there was had been used in a few laps, allowing the cars to run significantly underweight. After the race in Detroit, the water from the Tyrrell's tank was found to contain lead balls and hydrocarbons. The former contravened the rules against movable ballast, whilst the latter effectively made the water a fuel source and contravened the rules against refuelling. Tyrrell was excluded from the race and then disqualified from the championship entirely. The presence of hydrocarbons in the water was at worst cross-contamination. but there were greater forces at play. FISA wanted to make turbos mandatory from 1986, and Ken Tyrrell was vetoing this change, which required unanimous support. By excluding his team from the championship, that hurdle was overcome. Tyrrell would race under protest until Holland, and then be barred from further races. Then there was the race in the rain at Monaco, in which Ayrton Senna and Stefan Beloff marked themselves out as stars of the future, finishing in second and third places respectively. The race was won by Prost in controversial fashion, when clerk of the course Jackie Ickx stopped the race, just as Senna's Tolman was about to pass Prost for the lead. Senna's performance had transcended the limits of his car, and victory would have been well deserved. Prost had been signalling for the race to be stopped for several laps, despite no indication that the rain was any heavier than at other times during the race. In the end, half points were awarded, as the race was stopped before 75% distance had been completed. This victory was to cost Prost the World Championship. Elsewhere, Keke Rosberg claimed Honda's first victory since its return to Formula One in Dallas, on a track which was falling apart. 13 drivers destroyed their cars on the walls of the State Fair Park temporary circuit. Nigel Mansell was roundly criticised for aggressively defending his lead in the early laps, and then lost out on 5th place to Piercarlo Ghinzani Zossella on the last lap, when Mansell broke a drive shaft tapping the wall at virtually the last corner, and was forced to try and push the car to the finish line before collapsing from the effort. In 1985, 2 new teams entered with new engine suppliers. The German Zakspeed team would build their own car and turbo engines, whilst Formula 2 team Minardi would enter the sport using engines built by former Alfa Romeo engineer Carlo Citti under the Motori Moderni name. Beatrice Haas also entered Formula 1, expecting to run a new Ford turbo engine, but when this was delayed until 1986, they were forced to use Hart engines for their first season. The championship battle would be fought out between McLaren and Ferrari, Prost and Alboreto. The McLaren was generally the faster car, but Alboreto scored more consistently. There were just 3 points between the two drivers when the teams arrived at Monza with 5 races to run. Sadly, the Ferrari challenge imploded from Monza onwards, and Alboreto wouldn't finish another race, allowing Prost to stroll to his first World Championship. Williams won 4 races, with Rosberg and Mansell picking up 2 victories each. The Honda engine still had reliability issues, but was ferociously fast when it was running. The team won the last 3 races of the season, sending a signal that it would be a factor in 1986. Lotus had claimed 3 victories, with Senna, newly arrived from Tolman, winning in spectacular fashion in Portugal in the rain, his first ever victory, and then again in Belgium. De Angelis was also to take victory in what was to be a hugely controversial San Marino Grand Prix, which many claimed had been blighted by the fuel limits introduced the previous year. Qualifying had seen Senna take pole position, and the first 6 grid positions being taken by 5 different engine manufacturers. Qualifying and the race were going to be very different though. Imola was expected to be a high fuel consumption track, so whilst qualifying had shown whose car was fastest on full boost and soft tyres, much of practice was spent finding the optimum balance between fuel consumption and horsepower in order to finish the race without taking too much of a performance hit. From the start, Senna led away, with De Angelis getting the jump on Rosberg to gain 2nd place. The 2 Lotuses then started to pull away from the field, until lap 10, when the new Renault engine in De Angelis' car developed a misfire and he started dropping back, being passed by Alboreto and Prost. The Italian in the Ferrari had to retire with electrical problems shortly after, and the Italian crowd were briefly disconsolate, until something started happening behind the leaders, and it concerned the 2nd Ferrari. Ferrari had sacked René Arnoux, and at Imola, Swedish driver Stefan Johansson had been drafted in to replace him. In his first time in the car, Johansson had qualified a disappointing 15th, but as he became more familiar with his new mount during the race, he was finding some serious speed and carving through the field. He passed Lauda and then De Angelis to climb into 3rd place, and then with just 7 laps to run was past Prost into 2nd place, to the delight of the Tifosi. Prost had briefly challenged Senna for the lead, but the Brazilian had made good use of backmarkers to see off the McLaren driver, and then Prost had eased off, mindful of fuel consumption and making it to the end of the race. Senna had driven masterfully and was surely going to win his 2nd race on the bounce. But then, with just over 2 laps to go, the Lotus slowed, and Senna weaved it from side to side, trying to scare up some more fuel from his empty tank. The Lotus coasted to a halt as Johansson went past to take the lead, and the noise from the crowd was probably audible all the way back in Maranello. Just as quickly, there was an absence of sound, which was only amplified by the noise which had preceded it. The Ferrari too had run out of fuel, and just a lap and a half from a famous debut win for Ferrari in Italy, Johansson was stranded out on the circuit and out of the race. Prost swept by into the lead, one eye firmly fixed on his fuel readout, ensuring he could complete the last lap without drama. De Angelis was up into second place, perhaps the only driver not worrying about fuel, as his misfire meant that he had plenty left in the tank. Prost took the checkered flag and then ran out of fuel halfway around the slowing down lap. He had judged it perfectly. McLaren's engineers, however, had messed up their weight calculations and not added sufficient ballast to the car, which finished the race 4 kilograms underweight. Prost was disqualified and De Angelis declared the winner, having never led and having nursed an unhealthy car through more than 3/4 of the race. 1986 was to be the peak year of performance for turbo cars. Engine manufacturers took a money-no-object approach to extracting the maximum amount of power from their engines, using new materials inside the engine to withstand the incredible temperatures and forces generated, finding new ways of building turbochargers which could stand the extreme heat and massive boost pressures, and wrapping that all with new, precise engine management systems which could balance the restrictions on fuel supply with the need to keep the engine from blowing itself to bits. In 1986, manufacturers brought in the idea of sacrificial qualifying engines, which could be boosted to maximum performance but could last for no more than a couple of laps. In this form, engines were approaching 1500 brake horsepower, whilst in race trim they were still able to produce nearly 900. A far cry from the 400 brake horsepower the normally aspirated engines were producing when Renault first introduced turbocharging in 1977. 1986 was also to see the creation of the Gang of Four drivers who would dominate the sport for the next decade: Prost, Piquet, Senna and Mansell. In 1986 they were to undertake a season-long battle for the championship, with 3 drivers going to the season finale with a shot at the title. McLaren Tag had been the class of the field for 2 seasons, but at the end of 1985 it was clear that Williams Honda and Lotus Renault had closed the gap. Williams had signed Nelson Piquet from Brabham, whilst Rosberg had moved to McLaren as Prost's teammate. Senna was joined at Lotus by former British Formula 3 champion Johnny Dumfries, whilst Ferrari retained Alboreto and Johansson. There was a new team on the block too, Benetton, which had purchased the Toleman team and was now running BMW engines. Brabham, meanwhile, had replaced Piquet with Elio De Angelis and rehired Riccardo Patrese after an unsuccessful period with Alfa Romeo. Designer Gordon Murray had come up with an innovative new chassis which had the inline 4-cylinder BMW engine lying almost flat and the rest of the car reduced in height in an attempt to gain an aerodynamic advantage. The car was not a success, with the drivers finding it awkward to drive, whilst the prone driving position made it harder for them to breathe when racing. De Angelis would die when a rear wing failure caused him to crash at high speed in testing at Paul Ricard. The first half of the season was as competitive and unpredictable as any in the turbo era. All 4 of the leading drivers claimed victories, and, arriving at Silverstone, just 3 points separated Prost, Mansell and Senna, with Piquet having fallen back. At the British Grand Prix, Mansell led a Williams 1-2 to claim the championship lead for the first time. Piquet won 3 of the next 4 races to tighten the battle at the top. From Mansell in first to Prost in fourth there was an 11-point gap. Mansell, Piquet and Prost each won in the next 3 races, while Senna suffered retirements which eliminated him from the championship battle. With just 2 races remaining, Mansell led his teammate by 10 points, with Prost 1 more back. Things were looking good for the first British world champion since James Hunt. Mansell could seal the title with victory in Mexico, but disaster on the grid when Mansell was unable to select first gear meant that he dropped down the field and was only able to salvage 5th place in a race won by Gerhard Berger in the Benetton BMW, the first win for team and driver. With Prost second and Piquet fourth, this meant the battle would go to the last race in Australia, and what a race it turned out to be. McLaren set Rosberg off as a hare, hoping to draw Mansell and Piquet into a battle and destroy their tyres, whilst Prost ran more conservatively to look after his. Rosberg started pulling away in front, with Mansell and Piquet following. Perhaps the crucial moment of the race happened on lap 32, when Prost clipped Berger's Benetton when lapping the Austrian. This caused a puncture, and Prost stopped for a tyre change. When Goodyear's technicians inspected the tyres which had come off the McLaren, they saw little wear, and advised Williams that its drivers would be good to run to the finish without stopping. That was flawed information on 2 counts. Firstly, Prost had been looking after his tyres as part of his race strategy, whilst Piquet and Mansell had been battling each other, Senna and Rosberg. Secondly, past experience should have told all concerned that Prost was easier on his tyres than Mansell or Piquet. At the previous race in Mexico, Piquet had needed 3 tyre stops, Mansell 2, and Prost, well, he got away with just 1. The upshot of this misinformation was that on the 64th lap, heading down the Brabham straight at over 200 miles an hour, the left rear tyre of race leader Mansell's Williams delaminated dramatically, with the driver fighting for control all the way to the hairpin at the end of the straight, where he came to a halt out of the race. Piquet inherited the lead, but Williams needed to decide what to do about his tyres. The team made the safety first call and pitted the Brazilian for new tyres, handing the lead to Prost. Piquet rejoined 20 seconds behind the leader, needing to catch and pass the Frenchman if he were to become champion for the 3rd time. Piquet put in perhaps the drive of his life, breaking and re-breaking the lap record several times and reducing the gap to just 4 seconds when the checkered flag fell, coming up short but in the most spectacular way. Prost hadn't been secure in his victory though. His car had been telling him he had used too much fuel and was going to run out before the finish. Given the circumstances, Prost did the only thing he could: ignore the readout, drive for the finish line and hope for the best. The car stopped just after the finish, and a delighted Prost literally jumped for joy at securing his 2nd World Championship. It was a fitting end to the year. The race is a microcosm of the season as a whole, ebbing and flowing, with each of the drivers having the upper hand at some stage. Formula 1 as a turbo-only category had been a huge success. Over the 2 years, 9 drivers from 6 different teams had won races, and at no race was it ever clear which driver or team was going to be the strongest. However, there were some issues which were concerning the teams and the FIA. Engines were becoming so powerful that cars' performance was outgrowing the circuits they were racing on. This was further exacerbated by the introduction of qualifying engines. It was also adding to the cost of the sport and widening the gap between the well-funded manufacturer teams and the midfield and smaller teams on the grid. Before the end of 1986, the FIA announced that turbos were doomed. In 1987, 3.5 litre normally aspirated cars would run alongside the turbos, whose boost would be limited. Then, in 1988, turbo boost would be further reduced, before turbos were banned completely for 1989. In many ways, Prost had won the title in spite of the McLaren, rather than because of it, as had been the case in 1985. The Honda engine in the Williams had been the class of the field, and in 1987 that was even more obvious. Honda would now supply Lotus with its 1986 spec engines, a change forced by the withdrawal of Renault from the sport. The manufacturer that had started the turbo revolution had withdrawn its team from Formula 1 at the end of 1985, and at the end of 1986 it stopped supplying engines too. The season was to turn into a duel between Williams' teammates Piquet and Mansell. Initially, however, it was Prost and Senna who came out of the blocks faster, with Prost winning 2 of the first 3 races of the season, and Senna picking up the next 2. In amongst those results were contrasting fortunes for the Williams drivers at the San Marino Grand Prix. Mansell claimed race victory, but Piquet was not allowed to start following a simply monumental accident at Tamburello in qualifying, when a puncture sent the Williams off the road. From the 6th race of the season, though, the Williams was untouchable, winning 6 races in a row, 3 for each driver. Crucially for the championship, each time Mansell won, Piquet followed him home in 2nd place. The reverse was not true, and as a result, by the time the team were next beaten in Portugal, Piquet had opened up a 20-point lead on Mansell, and Senna had snuck through into 2nd place. Mansell won the next 2 races, which kept the title race alive to the final 2 in Japan and Australia. However, an accident in qualifying at Suzuka meant that he was unable to start the race, handing the title to Piquet by default. Whilst Honda were probably delighted to have the championship decided at the first Grand Prix at its new track, it was probably less than enthralled when Piquet's engine expired very publicly in the race, and Ferrari's Gerhard Berger claimed victory. Berger would double up with victory in Australia too, ending the season on a high note and hoping for a more competitive 1988. The final season of turbocharged engines would see some changes. Piquet moved from Williams to Lotus, replacing Senna, who would be joining Prost at McLaren. Honda would switch its primary engine supply from Williams to McLaren, leaving Williams to join the normally aspirated teams using the Judd V8 engine. Aside from Honda, the only teams still running turbo engines were Ferrari, Zakspeed, Arrows, who were using BMW engines rebadged as Megatron after the manufacturer's exit, and Osella, who was still running the old, thirsty and uncompetitive Alfa Romeo engines, which had lost factory support in 1985. The fuel restrictions and boost reductions for the turbo engines, including a new 155 litre fuel limit, were expected to hand the advantage to the normally aspirated teams. This reckoned without Honda's desire for its turbo engines to go out in style. Honda completely reworked the engine to meet the requirements of the new regulations, something no other turbo team invested in. Combined with the magnificent McLaren chassis from Steve Nicol and the unmatched brilliance of Prost and Senna, McLaren were all but untouchable. Across the 16 races, they won 15. The championship battle raged between the two teammates throughout the season, albeit without the hostility which would come the following year. At the first round, turbo cars claimed all 6 points positions, rather damaging the argument that normally aspirated cars would be competitive, Nigel Mansell's front row qualifying position notwithstanding. Any hopes of a competitive championship were wiped away in the first few races. By mid-season, Prost and Senna were out of reach, and it was clear that the title was likely to hinge on which of the two won the most races. McLaren weren't beaten until the 12th race of the season at Monza, and only then when Senna was knocked out of the race when lapping rookie backmarker Jean-Louis Schlesser. This opened the door for Berger and Alboreto to claim an emotional 1-2 finish for Ferrari, just weeks after Enzo's death. Berger's win meant that the world title was going to go to the first McLaren driver to reach 8 victories. Senna had 7 to Prost's 4 and seemed favourite. But victories for the Frenchman in Portugal and Spain tightened things up. Arriving in Japan for the penultimate race, Senna could seal the title by winning, or Prost could take it down to the wire in Australia by beating his teammate. Starting from pole position, Senna botched his start completely and had dropped to 14th position by the first corner, lucky that he hadn't been hit in the chaos his slow start had caused. From there, he started a stunning recovery drive. Any place but first was of no use to Senna, so he took a high-risk strategy, grabbing anything that looked like a passing opportunity and making it stick. By lap 3 he had climbed up to 7th place. Then, by working his way past Patrese, Alboreto, Nannini and Berger, he was in 3rd place by lap 11. Prost, meanwhile, had problems of his own. What should have been an easy cruise to victory was proving anything but. In 2nd place sat Ivan Capelli's Judd-powered March, which qualified an excellent 4th and was now matching Prost, keeping the leader on his toes and making things much less comfortable than Prost would have liked. Capelli had even briefly taken the lead before Honda power dragged the McLaren back ahead. On lap 19, rain started to fall, and Capelli was right with Prost again, but now the battle for the lead was 3 cars, not 2, as Senna had closed the gap. Almost immediately, Capelli's engine suffered a problem, and the Italian was forced to slow, and Senna was through to 2nd place. By lap 27, it was all over. Prost was slow in lapping the Real of Andrea De Cesaris, and Senna pounced, flying past them both to take the lead, and then pulling out a 3-second lead over the next lap alone. By the checkered flag, Senna had pulled 13 seconds clear, and by winning the race became the last ever Turbo-era world champion. The 1988 championship was the last hurrah for pure turbo power. Honda's swan-song engine and McLaren's MP4 wrapped up the title, but beneath the celebrations lay a bitter truth. The amazing turbo-era engines were being consigned to the history books in museum halls. Formula One had lost something special, as pure power gave way to cost controls and electronic aids, a trend which continues very much today. In 2014, Formula One entered a new hybrid V6 turbo era. Modern power units prioritise fuel efficiency, emissions and cost caps. Gone are the days of unconstrained boost and wastegates welded shut for ultimate qualifying blasts. Today's Formula One has lost the raw, visceral thrill of the turbo-era cars. With unprecedented power, engines which ran on the knife edge between glory and disaster, and the knowledge that things could change not just from race to race, but often from lap to lap. The fiery monsters are gone, and I, for one, still mourn their passing.